The ghost town is a classic feature of the American West. Whether it's a mining town that's sprung up in the middle of nowhere after a lucky strike, only to fade away after the ore ran out, or a town that served as a travel point between mountains or over tundra, but then when a new highway went 100 miles away, had no reason to exist. But in fact, there have been towns that have faded away all over the United States and many parts of the world. The reason they're preserved in the West is they're often in desert climates instead of dealing with winter storms and rain and whatnot. And also the western part of the United States was settled much later. And there are people that have gone to these ghost towns while they were still preserved and turned them into tourist attractions. But here's the thing. In the world of D&D, with magic and fantastical events, abandoned towns don't have to fall prey to the elements. Plus, you can have events transpire that drive off every inhabitant of a once thriving city. They leave everything just as it was, food on the table, the hearth still smoldering. Vast cities that once thrived now stand empty. Cursed villages are mute testaments to the crimes of their inhabitants. See what I mean? Hello again, folks. KR King here, as always, dedicated to helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. And I think ghost towns are an excellent environment for storylines and encounters. And though they don't have to conform to the historical reality of ghost towns in the real world, those real world examples do give you some basic outlines that you can do to create ghost towns in your world that make sense to the players. So as always, I'm going to create a checklist of things that you should consider when creating a ghost town. So the first and most obvious question is, why did it die off? How big is the settlement? What condition is it in? And does anyone still live there? So, of course, our first question is, why did people, or in the world of D&D, sentient creatures, all collect themselves in an area and build structures to live in and then abandon them? And as always, I subdivide this into two further categories, which I call the ghost story starting conditions. Either the raison d'etre of why the town was built has ended, or some catastrophe event has occurred such that the residents abandon the town. Raison d'etre is French for reason, and this is a classic ghost town starting condition. A town was built near a resource, and that resource is either depleted or it has disappeared. You know, the mining boomtown is abandoned once the ore is gone. The logging community goes away after all the trees have been cut down. A resort town disappears when the lake either dries up or gets polluted. And in D&D, you have magical effects which can do this much more quickly or weirdly. Plants suddenly become sentient in an area and refuse to be farmed, or umber hulks, infest a mine and make it unusable. And it's important to note that when you have a town that was built for a specific resource, there should be no other things in the area that give it a justification to continue. So if a mining town, they run out of ore, there's no reason, they can't be farming, or there's no reason for people to visit, a tourist trade where you could have taverns or something. Because it needs to be logical, and people are abandoning buildings that they built, paid for or still owe on. Plus, they lived in this town, they raised their families, they have a history here. Now they're forced to get up and leave and go somewhere where they have no connection. Picking up everything that you can basically carry to go live with strangers is a big deal. So keep that in mind when you create a town in which the reason it exists is one single resource. The other interesting thing is these sort of towns, these resource towns, they sort of wither away much more than, are just abandoned. So as we'll see, you have sort of proto-ghost towns, which are withering away but not completely abandoned. They're on their way. And as always, these are usually a resource location gone bad. Now, the second category, a catastrophe or event that causes a ghost town, can strike anywhere, any town. It's not dependent on some resource going away. And just as in the real world, there are many different categories for this. It opens up a lot of possibilities in the world of D&D. You might have a plague that wipes out half the inhabitants of a town and the rest are forced to just flee and carry what they can. You could have a warlord that conquers a geographic area that encompasses this town, and he orders all of the inhabitants to leave because they didn't support him during the war. And then instead of razing it to the ground, he leaves all the buildings there as mute testament to what happens to those who don't bend to his will. And instead of a plague as a disease, you could have some kind of magical contamination that forces inhabitants of a village or town to leave. You could have some sort of planar disruption. Think of the classic Lovecraft story, Color Out of Space, in which a meteor lands on a farm and begins to infect people and makes the farm uninhabitable. This relates to real-world examples like Chernobyl in Ukraine, or Love Canal in the United States. Chernobyl, obviously the radiation poisoning from the accident. Love Canal, you had pollution from industrial waste. And of course, a catastrophe can be a curse by some very powerful creature or demigod that forces residents to flee very quickly. You can also have a geological event. Let's say fissures open up under a town. They have noxious poisonous gas, or they're scalding hot, and they force the residents to leave. In the United States, you have towns built over coal mines in which a fire starts in the coal mine. They can't put it out. They can literally burn for hundreds of years, and the towns have to be abandoned. And in D&D, you could have creatures, in the Underdark that are tunneling or whatever, and they release these gases or fissures and render the town unlivable. But they also could create a new entrance for someone who's exploring the abandoned town. You could have a town that was built on unsteady ground. The town is slowly sinking. Think of if it's islands like Venice, which is sinking. But of course, in D&D, you can do this much more quickly. You can always accelerate a process. Think of that movie The Day After, which accelerates the process of climate change to be basically like a month. When you have geological events that destroy a town, let's say an earthquake or a flood, these are ruined towns, not necessarily ghost towns. Now, you can have ruined towns in your world, and in fact, you can apply a lot of the concepts that I'm talking about in this video, but technically, they're ruins. And you can have a political event that occurs near a town that's sort of mundane, it's not spectacular, but it renders it uninhabitable. I mentioned, a road that's built 50 miles away, suddenly no one wants to use the old road. You have a river that lowers its water level, flatboats and traders can't get up the river to some point, so they have to move back down. A bridge is built downstream from a town that has one of those pulley ferries that it uses, and no one goes there. And oftentimes the people from such a town will move to the new town with the bridge and abandon the old. All right, so our next category is what is the size of your ghost town? It can range from a few buildings, a little hamlet, up to a vast city. We tend to think of ghost towns as small, a village or something, because often they're built around a resource, a mining town, something like that, that has a boom period, but never gets really huge because with one resource, there's just a limit to how many people are going to move there. So if you want to have a ghost town that's a large city, it's usually an event. Think of like Chernobyl or something like that. So one nice thing about keeping your ghost town small is it's easier to draw up, to envision. If you have players running through some vast metropolis ghost town, if you don't want to map that all out, you still do a lot of it theater of the mind, it can get a little squishy. Because even if you are going to run things theater of the mind, it's really good to have a map drawn up so that when you're looking at it, you have a sense of what's happening. But having said that, if you have a vast city, let's say out in the center of a vast desert that is totally abandoned, this can be a really cool place for storylines and encounters. You can do multiple sessions over this. So, don't necessarily just do it because it's hard. And of course, when you have a large area, that means lots more things can move in to take over. But again, usually you're going to have a ghost town be a village or small town. All right, so the next thing is what is the condition of the ghost town and what are the reasons for the preservation, if any? I grew up in Michigan. You had lots of logging towns that disappeared. You had mining of the copper mines up north. And when these petered out, these towns were abandoned and the elements, the snows of the winter, the freezing and melting and rain, all the wooden structures fell down. And then within a few decades, they rotted away. And really what you only have are the foundations of buildings, some stone walls, and you usually have a graveyard. And if you're using graveyards, they should be part of your ghost town. I have a video that talks about using graveyards. Check that out because they do make a great part of a graveyard, and it's logical that they would still be there. The thing is about having a ghost town that's just completely ruined, you can have some interesting encounters, especially if there's some connection to underground chambers, if there's some dungeon there or something. But typically it's better if you really want to have a ghost town to have at least a couple of structures that are still preserved. So how do you justify, especially if you're going back hundreds of years or something, why these buildings are there? Well, you can use the environmental thing. If it's in a desert, some area where the weather isn't going to destroy structures very quickly. And of course, you can have a catastrophe such that the town was abandoned. It could be very recently, such that the elements wouldn't have yet worked their way against the structures. And this is something that I pointed out on my earlier video, which I'll put a link up here, about creating a ghost ship. It's one thing to have a building or town abandoned or crumbling, which is the condition of most of the ghost towns that you're going to create. It is creepy to see a house that once housed a family or a tavern that was once bustling with customers to be abandoned and ruined, broken windows and trash on the floor and whatnot. But it is what you would expect with an abandoned building. But when it appears that residents just left, literally in the middle of doing things, and the buildings are all, exactly as they were, this is where it gets into the uncanny. The uncanny is a very important aspect of horror. If you have a robot which looks almost human, or animation that looks almost human, it takes on a very weird, a very disturbing element when we see it as human beings. This is the uncanny that's been described by Sigmund Freud and by writers such as E.T.A. Hoffman. The idea here is that a town that isn't simply, been abandoned and allowed to decay, but was abandoned very suddenly, and for whatever reason is just as it was, except there's no people, fills us with a certain dread, fills us with a feeling that some taboo was broken here. And if you have an entire city, say out in some remote area, which clearly was just totally abandoned midstream, as it were, the effect is even more profound. And with that in mind, I'd say the final reason that an abandoned city would be totally preserved is that we're in a world of D&D. There are magical effects, so you don't have to worry about it. Because if some really powerful curse drove off most or all of the inhabitants or killed them in place, the power of that magic might also preserve the structures. It's basically in stasis. And when the players enter this town, they're going to feel this dread and unease by this unnatural condition. So you can use this for ghost towns in very tough climates, let's say the Arctic, mountains, or a jungle. Because even if miners abandon a town in the mountains once the ore ran out, where did they dig? What did they release? What sort of magical powers? We talked about, steam or noxious things. Maybe there's magic in there that preserves the town. And when the players go there and see that things are unnaturally preserved, they're going to be curious as to what is going on. And the final category is who lives in the ghost town. And you may say, well, wait a second, it's a ghost town, no one should live there, but not so fast. Because you could have a town that is withering away. As I said, the proto-ghost town, or the truly is a ghost town, you only have one or two old-timers that have just refused to leave, or some crazy person that has nowhere else to go. And these old coots can be a tremendous source of information to the players. They can give them a history of the town, a history of why it's been abandoned, and they can give them information on anything that's bizarre that's been going on around recently. And you should check out the film The Outlaw Josie Wales. There's a scene where he visits this town that has faded in the Old West. There's only like 4 people left in this saloon. I've always thought to myself it would be cool to recreate those characters in a D&D setting. You can also have people that simply refuse to leave a poisoned or cursed town. In Chernobyl, there's something like 1,200 people who refused to leave. They went back and stayed. And now there's less than 100 left. So you could have the same thing that's infused with some curse or plague or planar distortion. People that just refuse to leave. And what has happened to them over the time that they've stayed in the abandoned town? Would they be slowly withering away with horrible scars, or would they be gaining psionic powers? That's the beauty of D&D. But even if you have a town that was completely abandoned by its original inhabitants, you could have NPCs that go there, or creatures or whatever that say, hey, look at all these structures. These are keep me out of the elements and I can operate from here. And now these creatures or NPCs, maybe there's technology or magic powers or things they've discovered in the town that make them want to stay here more and protect it. They might have also discovered books or other information. Let's say they're fairly benign, they're living there, but the players come there to investigate something. Again, they're not original residents that just hung on. There's people that just came along and thought, oh, look at this town, I'm going to stay here. You could also have a gang of bandits or evil cultists that come across the town, but of course they're going to want to keep the location of this, the fact that they're there, away from prying eyes. And finally, if the abandoned town is connected in some way to the underground, the Underdark, all sorts of creatures may use this town, wherever these connections are, to come out and hunt or whatever, go back down. And again, they want to keep these openings and everything secret. They may be eliminating anyone who comes to the abandoned town and tries to revive it. All right, so there's some tips on creating a ghost town in your world that has a logically historical timeline, logical size, logical condition, and some ideas on who might be living there. Here's the thing, ghost towns are really great for storylines and encounters because they have an inherent flair built into them with the story of why it was abandoned. And if you like the content on my channel, please subscribe. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments because I love to read and to comment back. Most importantly, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.